Wyoming countryside.
Oh, great. I just shoveled another foot off of off of the places that need shoveling.
Well, it's good to have the precipitation. That's
It is.
actually encouraging.
It is. Yeah, maybe coming your way soon.
Yes. So I share Nick's excitement in today's program with Chris and Shannon. We met Chris a few years ago, and Chris got very active in our advancing equity with asset leadership committee. And we were honored to learn that after he had been involved with us and helped write a document that got sent to the Biden administration, that he took back to Portland some of the ideas and helped shape the policy that they were writing. And when it came out, I consider it could be an equity policy as well as an asset management policy. And of course, our assets should be used to provide equitable service to all the citizens. So they don't know it, but this whole series was basically a way to get them to talk. And so Chris and Shannon, if you can join us and share the journey of the asset management policy in Portland, and really thank you so much for all that you do.
Yeah, thank you, Mike and Nick. Really appreciate it, and appreciate all the programming of the ALN. We're going to start by doing a pretty quick introductions, and I hope we can live up to the excitement. It's kind of cool that there's excitement over a policy. You're going to hear, I think it's a saga. You're going to hear a saga that took place over a few years. And this is not going to be like a really technical asset management statistics kind of presentation. This is a discussion about organizational dynamics and that sort of thing. So first, we'll give you a little bit about ourselves. Then I'm going to give you some background of why we took this on, why we decided to have a policy. And Shannon's going to really explain the how, like how did this actually come about? And of course, we're eager to talk, but we're also eager to listen and hear your questions and ideas. And then if there's time, we can share a little bit about what's next for us in Portland. So my name is Chris Silkie. I'm the program manager for asset management for the Portland Parks and Recreation. I use he, him pronouns. Just really brief biographical information. Started in the U.S. Coast Guard, and actually many of you know Jack Dempsey. He might be out there. His path and mine intersected several times. And then State Department, and then consulting. Actually did a project. I think one of your sponsors is Onuma. We worked with them when I was on a consulting team, and then came to the city of Portland. And Dr. Reynolds, would you mind introducing yourself?
Hello, everyone. Shannon Reynolds. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the risk assessment division manager. I'm an engineering manager, but my official role is as a risk assessment division manager for service delivery for wastewater and stormwater services for the city of Portland. Just brief background on me. I started my engineering career running combined sewer models for computer models for the city of Philadelphia. And that's how I got into the combined sewer part of risk assessment. We were doing some life cycle costing, triple bottom line analysis for urban heat island influences. And that was pretty early asset management type evaluations before it was really called infrastructure asset management, I would say. So that's where I kind of cut my teeth on this work, and then just progressed through up to where I am now. Happy to be here.
Great, thanks, Shannon. Nick, would you mind bringing up the first slide, please? All right, Portlandia. It's not like the show. If any of you've seen the show, this statue is one of the many crown jewels in the city of Portland. And I wanted to start with this image. for a couple reasons. Number one, it's an amazing statue, and I invite everyone to come view it in person for yourself. It's truly amazing. It symbolizes many things, including the land meeting the sea. We have trees in the picture. We have our primary municipal building. You know, there's streets, sidewalks. Beneath those streets, there's stormwater, wastewater, water, all sorts of utilities, and they all have different departments managing, investing, and taking care of all of that different infrastructure. But there's something else. A little bit of the history of Portlandia, the statue. So first, it's the second largest pounded copper statue in the United States after the Statue of Liberty. And it was selected through a public process. They had art experts and people from the community participate in selecting the work of art that was going to be produced there. And when I read that, it gets me thinking, well, who actually participated in that? It was a bit before my time. And so that's one of the questions that just comes to my mind. So who? And then if you dig further, well, let's look at the history of Oregon. Let's look at the history of the land that the city of Portland was built on. And in the 1850s, the land of Oregon was doled out by colonizers taken from Native Americans. And it all happened even before treaties were signed with tribes. So originally this land was stewarded by over 60 tribes, and it's debatable about whether the treaties were even, quote, signed. And then when they were signed, did the federal government of the United States live up to the promises that were in those treaties? So that history is important, because what asset management needs to be about is looking back at that history. What's the history of development and investment? Who participated, who benefits, and who is going to benefit going forward, generations into the future, and how? So I just say that to set the stage, and that reflection was pretty important to me personally in launching on the developing of policy. So you could go ahead and put that down if you don't mind, Nick. Not to the next slide yet. We can just put it down so we can talk a little bit. Thank you.
So Chris, can I quickly just interject? One thing we forgot to mention is that Chris and I are here as and speaking as individuals. We're not really here speaking on behalf as representatives necessarily from the city of Portland. So this was just really more our personal individual experience in working on the asset management policy. So we just wanted to make sure that was noted as we get into.
Thank you for making that note, Shannon. That's really important.
Yes, thank you so much, Shannon, especially right before what I'm about to say. No, just kidding. So a few years ago, is 2018, 2019, there's a group, Shannon, myself, and a handful of others who are like-minded. We work in our departments, what we call them in Portland, bureaus. And you know, we're the subject matter experts for asset management within those departments. We meet once a month to talk about technical issues, talk about organizational issues, and really just try to advance the practice of asset management within the city. And so that's 12 hours a year. What can you accomplish in 12 hours a year? You know, monthly meetings. And we were debating, what should we try to do? What should we try to accomplish as a group in this coming year? And there were a number of ideas. You know, should we try to do a training program? Should we work on visualization and do some GIS thing or something like that? Because 12 hours a year, you know, you got to pick one, and that's about it. And the idea came up of, well, we've been saying we have this infrastructure deficit for years and years and years and years, and we're not seeing movement to fix that, to correct that situation. What about a policy? You know, could we write a policy that helps mobilize around this idea that we need to do something? And so that was in the running, not settled yet on. That's the thing we're going to work on. Then a few things happened. One, on the side, a resilience planning effort started. And that kind of forced us to all look at the interdependencies of all this infrastructure. The first responders can't get to the fire if the bridge is out, or if the water, a big water main over a highway causes traffic to stop. And there's many places where all of this infrastructure totally intersects. We had some parks facilities designated for sheltering. Well, people need to get there. They need water, they need wastewater, and so on. So the interdependencies of our infrastructure in the times of emergency when it's really needed started us to look at things this way. So that's number one. Number two is that I'll call it a policy window opened up. And what happened is one of our first responder organizations ran into this circumstance where critical gear and equipment for them was going to expire all at once. And they had to do an emergency procurement. They had to get emergency supplemental funding and really scramble to make sure that they had proper emergency response equipment. And that really generated the visibility around the need to plan, the need to know what your investments need to be over time. And then the third critical ingredient was we had a champion in leadership position who really provided support. And it was our chief financial officer. And they saw the value and really, they weren't asset management experts, but they encouraged us. And so of those things, the visualization, GIS, training programs, we embarked on writing a policy. And so Shannon's going to tell you a little bit about how that went.
Yeah, so I think that, like Chris said, that window of opportunity really, I would say, for the list of things that were kind of noodling on as a group, it really put into sharp focus where we had the support we needed to actually move something forward as an affinity group. Really, at the time, we were really more an affinity group and just trying to do better for the city within our areas of expertise on asset management. And so having all of those things happen and kind of come to fruition at the same time really presented an opportunity for us to focus our work plan on developing an asset management policy. So, and just really opened up the eyes to others, seeing the value in outside of our small group, non-asset management infrastructure folks, leadership folks, that we need to do different, and we need some guidance in how to do that. And here we have this group that's willing to offer something. So that was kind of the impetus. We I think I would say really quickly coalesced into a small group of 3 to 5 experts, mostly mid-level managers, myself, Chris, and three, I think about 3 others who really represented the main infrastructure bureaus, who really kind of had the most experience in implementing asset management best practices in their own departments or parts of the city. I guess in hindsight, this is a really important decision that we made to have a focus group to start drafting the asset management policy, as opposed to having all representatives from all asset owning bureaus contribute to the development. It was an early decision to have this small focus group, and that worked really well. We met biweekly. It was pretty intense. I'll say it was biweekly for 1.5 to 2 hours each time, and it was, is a very vocal group of people, right? So we had a lot of debate, emphasis on debate, right? So there was disagreements, a lot of good discussion. It was all very respectful, I would say, but there were discussions around existing standards versus developing an organization's own, right? So how much do we prescribe versus how much free reign do we kind of give and just give overarching guidance? Who is the primary audience? Who would be reading this policy and needing to implement it or enforce it? What to include, what not to include, or what we should include, but are not sure. How sophisticated did we want the policy to be around asset management, and really being careful about terminology. I think there was also a lot of discussion about governance and accountability. I think that was a big part of all of these things is, what is the governance of this? It's one thing to just say, here is this policy. It's another thing to add, and here are the bodies of individuals or groups that should be enforcing it at each step or at each level in the organization. And so it was very clear what, for instance, our financial group for the city would be doing with respect to our policy, what the directors or the people who lead each individual department should be how they should be supporting this policy. So that was a lot of debate that went on there. We divvied up the work. So we outlined the policy as a collaboration in that small focus group. And then once we felt pretty good about how the outline was shaping up, we divided it up into, assigned kind of, and I wouldn't say subgroups, because it was really, there was 3 to 5 of us at any given time. So it was, you take this section, you take this section and do the best you can. And then we brought it all back together and did some pretty intensive word by word wordsmithing, right? So we went through every practically, I can't remember exactly how many pages it started as, but it was too big. There was a lot of content, and we really scaled it back. But we did that by intentionally reading everything and saying, is that what we really mean to say? Are you hearing it or reading it the same way, interpreting it the same way? So we really tried to be intentional about that. There was more debate as a part of that, good debate. I'll say personally, I learned a lot from my fellow peers in those sessions. It was a really good learning opportunity. And then there's a lot of stubborn, entrenchment. And I think, one thing I'll point out here too, is there was a lot of conversation around resiliency and equity. And a lot of us are still learning in those realms. And so I think we all understood that none of us have answers for that. And so we're trying to craft guidance while also still learning ourselves. And so how do you do that without overreaching or potentially making big mistakes, right? So we were really cognizant of that. So that required a lot of debate and discussion, which was great. We then widened the circle to others. So this is when we started bringing in the rest of the asset owning bureaus who are a part of KMG, and started to get their input on how they felt about the language we had crafted. And then we revised. We took their input back to the core, to the small focus group, and edited and tried to incorporate and address as much of the input that we got, feedback that we got from outside. This whole process took about 2 years. And in looking back, I would say, that seems like a long time, but when you consider that we started this in 2019, I believe, and that was right at the beginning of right before the pandemic hit. For the city of Portland, we were vacated from our office spaces. It was really hugely disruptive. So considering all of those things happening while we were trying to do this very intensive work, I think 2 years was actually pretty remarkable now that I look back at it. Even though it was an exhausting process, it took a lot.
And it was a part-time effort, right?
Right. Yeah. So this was in addition to our day-to-day work. So we weren't taking anything, at least on my part. I know I wasn't taking anything off of my day-to-day work to to contribute to this.
And it seems
So
like
this
you
is-
expanded from the 1 hour a month to quite a bit more time that you
Yeah.
dedicated to this effort.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. It
thank
was definitely a labor of love, I would say. I think we all believed in it and felt like it was something that really needed to happen. I think, again, at this point, we now had a lot of support from not just a handful, 1 or 2 champions in the leadership realm. We had pretty much all of their scrutinizing, like they were, I think they were interested in what was going to come from this. And so that was good and bad at the same time, that kept us motivated, but also was a little bit, pushed us to try to get it dialed in as much as we could. Yeah, and so just to wrap up here, we, like Chris said, we started off with the support of the chief financial officer. We ended up with a good deal of our own bureau the directors who manage the different bureaus or departments, a lot of their support, which was great. So all along the way, we were kind of keeping people informed. And that really helped establish, by the time we got done towards the end of the 2 years where we were ready to take this to council, we already had a great deal of support generated from leadership, and they were already helping us strategize about how do we approach council with this, what is the process, and kind of greasing the wheels in advance. And so we were having a lot of conversations to get our directors up to speed, or our directors up to speed, so that they could communicate to the council members, and that helped a lot. We couldn't have done it. We couldn't have gone to council and gotten it approved without that, frankly. There's no way that our little focus group could have, I think, done that without the support of our direct supervisors.
Yeah, the asset management expertise does not necessarily mean policy expertise in whatever government you're working in. So I know, speaking for myself, I know that's true.
Yeah, and so and the last thing I'll say is that our asset management policy really centered around 4 main goals, which is climate action, resiliency, equity, and then economic drivers. So that was kind of our core grounding categories that we focused on for the policy.
Yeah, and there's a question. Thank you, Shannon, so much. I really appreciate this webinar, Mike, because Shannon and I, it caused us to reflect on this experience. And yeah, it was a pretty intense schedule for several years, and it's something that we're fairly proud of. And there are some lessons learned, I think, from that. We're kind of exhausted by that. I did post a link to the policy in the chat. Nick, would you mind bringing up the second slide? Because there's a question in the chat about the interdependency. And
that question is from Mark DeClerc. He's from Michigan, and he has municipal asset management experience and is now a consultant.
Oh, great. Go Blue or go Spartans. So this is one of those resiliency workshops, what you see here that we're talking about. And these in 2019 and 2018, these workshops were starting. They were convened by the emergency response part of the organization, but focused on infrastructure readiness as opposed to operational resiliency. So that started planting the seed. And yes, we did focus on that in the policy. And one of the lessons learned, I think I mentioned, we were a bit exhausted, and some of the first questions you get are like, okay, what now? You get this policy, like, we can't mistake policy for action. And I think it's a good policy, it's a good reference, but immediately those questions come. What's the plan? And I was, we should have prepared more for that. We should have either towards the end or all along be ready for the what's next. The other thing is, there was a conscious decision to make this a fairly easy yes and not be tied to a large resource ask. And I think that was necessary to get passage. The resource asks will come, but the first step shouldn't necessarily include them. And then one last thing I want to emphasize is that we have this core group that's working on policy development, sharing best practices on asset management. There are some departments that did own and manage infrastructure, but they didn't have asset management expertise in their departments. And they were kind of left behind when it comes to reporting and planning and things like that. And so we had to keep in mind, we want to lift everybody up because of this interdependency. You know, it does no good if only our water utility or wastewater utility does outstanding asset management. Like, that's great. It doesn't help the city enough for that to be the case. The fire department needs to do it. The police department needs to do it. The, you know, housing, economic development agencies, the parks and rec organizations, everybody needs to, because of those interdependencies and because of the need to plan in a coordinated fashion. So those are some of the lessons learned. And then Shannon, I think you had some thoughts as well on lessons learned.
Yeah, so we would have benefited, I think, from a facilitator. So that's one thing that, you know, it was a lot to be thinking strategically about the content and then having to do the logistical stuff, right? Work around everybody's schedules, planning meetings, making sure, you know, the document was actually getting edited, who was, you know, it was a lot. And so I think it probably would have been more efficient if we had a facilitator and a document owner that wasn't the SMEs. And then maybe that's obvious, but you know, at the time we just didn't have that resource. I will say that effort and the policy, I think, did help us get somebody who is a convener now for CAMG. So we are now more legitimately supported by the city. And I think that because of my perspective is that because of the value of the asset management policy and the good work we did and are continuing to do as a result of that, by engaging with our council members more directly now through our directors, they see that we are of value to the city on asset management strategy. So that is something that I think in hindsight was just a wonderful outcome that was organic and not planned for. So that was great.
But the lesson learned is, if anyone's trying to do this, maybe get the support, more support from the CFO, and have the CFO assign a facilitator, somebody who could give administrative support to the hard work that you were providing.
Yeah,
That would have been awesome.
Yeah, it would have been awesome.
Yeah.
And hindsight's 2020, right? I think just getting the support of the CFO to begin with was huge, right? So I think you know, I would say if you can only get that far, you're probably doing pretty well. And I know I see some comment there about that the financial people seem to really embrace the asset management kind of concept more than maybe some other disciplines. And I would say I've had that experience too, that they get it, right? Because it does end up directly tying to the budget, right? And long-term investments. And I'll take it a step further and say that, you know, from my part, this is really about intergenerational equity and being mindful of how we're investing in our infrastructure now and our assets and our services now, so that they are sustainable into our next generations and the generations that follow, without burdening them with astronomical emergency costs for those same services. So yeah, I think they get it on that tactical level. And then I will say this is really an exercise in practicing intergenerational equity better.
And those comments are coming from Art Curlin, who is the Director of Capital and Asset Management for University Health, and he has an accounting background, so of course he's going to say that. But they do. We have seen it over and over. We have someone from DC government here, and DC government's asset management initiative was launched through the CFO's office also. So we see that very clearly. This is a CFO responsibility almost.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm curious, Mike or Nick or anyone, we could go into the what happened next and talk about that a little bit, or if there's more
Do you need this
questions.
slide up anymore?
Not this one. If we're going to talk about what happens next, I think the next slide is relevant.
Do you want to, oh, well, yeah, go ahead.
So we were a little bit surprised, but then also successful, as Shannon mentioned, in getting some more centralized resource support. So remember, the origin was the utilities, or the municipally owned utilities, the transportation, parks and recreation, and the entity responsible for municipal buildings, or I should say some municipal buildings, but not all. And there's actually more infrastructure owning departments out there. So hooray, get the policy passed. And then someone, and so the great thing that happens once you get city council attention, you know, there's talking points and presentations, and there's a lot more attention. You know, all of a sudden you're a little more popular than you were before there was a policy. And one of the great things about that is that these monthly meetings, which, you know, may or may not be at a quorum, started to get much better attendance from all the invitees after the policy. And someone had the idea of, well, let's show people what we're talking about. Like, let's do a physical tour, and we're going to show good infrastructure. We're going to show infrastructure that's been neglected. And so through a tremendous effort, we actually gave tours to each of the elected officials, like a bus tour, an all-day tour, you know, visiting the wastewater plant, a pool that actually was closed because of an infrastructure issue. Sadly, you know, and in each one of these, frontline staff and others had an opportunity to engage with the elected officials and their staffs and explain what they were seeing. And every time this illustrated asset management principles. We may not necessarily call it by, you know, the right term, but every time it was asset management principles, including trees and natural areas and what we call our nature patches or sustainable landscapes. That was another element that was very important to include in one of those debates that Shannon mentioned. I think she and I were probably the two who wanted to, like, hey, let's not forget about our natural infrastructure. And just to give you a flavor of the debate, so it's like, well, you're talking about assets, that means physical assets and natural infrastructure is included. So you don't need to call it out specially. Well, that's what it was for the last 10 years, and it hasn't resulted in equitable attention. So let's make sure we call it out specifically, that it's natural and built infrastructure. So this policy is applicable to all of our natural and built infrastructure. And so the tour included some of those assets, as well as just some amazing work, very advanced asset management, reliability centered maintenance, condition monitoring, and all that for one of the facilities. And then in contrast, on the other side, like completely failing assets that just should be closed or are closed. And so that tour really, really helped get the buy-in for where we're going next. And so what you see here is a roadmap. So that was step 2, engage council. Step 3 was the non-infrastructure owning departments have a role to play, you know, especially like planning is a big one. And then what's happening right now, there's actually check marks by them. I think we're actually still wrapping them up, but is a maturity assessment across all the departments. Where are you in the different elements of asset management? And then also funding, like what's your funding stability, and adequacy, diversity of funding sources to actually make the investments that your commitments say you should be making. And next month, there should be a presentation at the end of the month of the findings from those assessments. So it's kind of this annual engagement with our elected officials around these topics. And these assessments are going to result in areas to work, and that'll require investment or policy edits or refinements. So that's kind of the big picture of where we went. And Nick, you can go ahead and put down this slide if you would, please.
Well, can you talk about the council's role before you leave that slide? Or is that later?
Sure. Yeah, I'll get to it. It's actually a great question, because so here's what happened in November in Portland, which is really exciting, is the voters of Portland decided that we no longer want the city and government structure that we have today, that we're going to move from what's called a commission form of government, where these elected officials in today or yesterday's framework manage these departments. So like Shannon and I, we each have different what we call commissioners in charge. And so it's an elected official who is also an executive over that department. The voters decided that they don't want that anymore. And in 2 years, the city of Portland will completely shift forms of government, and it'll be a larger city council that is elected in districts and focuses on policy, and a separate mayor executive or mayor and city administrator executive. So that changes, like balls rolling on that. And so a lot of our efforts are going to be moving towards supporting those institutional changes. But all this work we've been doing feeds directly into that, all these interdependencies we've been talking about. So the governance structure will help this collaboration rather than not propel it.
And can I extend on that thought a little bit, because there is a question in the chat about, does the city have a strategic asset management plan in place? And I think, no, we don't. So the city of Portland does not have a strategic asset management plan. And I would argue, as an individual, large reason for that is because of our form of government, right? It's just does not enable that kind of collaboration and strategic development. I'm hopeful that, like Chris said, with the new changes, we will be in a better position organizationally as a city to have that conversation about developing a strategic asset management plan for the city that, maybe leverages this asset management policy to help guide it. That's my hope anyway. So I think that's just trying to connect the dots maybe for folks. It is a challenge because of the way we are structured to have any kind of, resiliency really is challenging because of that, for that same reason. So the hope is that we're going to be better positioned in the future to tackle those things.
So Nick, will you put up the last slide again? Because I want to emphasize that this is a presentation in the series of advancing outcomes with asset management. And the reason why it's called that is because Jack Dempsey said, don't have policy month, Mike. Nobody will come if you call it policy month. But that's what I wanted to call it to get Portland to present. But look at these. Look at these outcomes from the policy. Well, first of all is the policy, and that's great. But the council is engaged. The bureaus are engaged. Their maturity assessments, and now funding, I think, probably has, a North Star, some better rationale for funding based on the policy. And most people are talking about outcomes of, less downtime of sewer systems, better recovery of electricity, things that are asset oriented. But of course, a municipality is going to have a different concept of what outcomes to have. And I think this is really good. You probably didn't even intend for all of this to happen, but look what you started because you established an asset management policy. It's really great.
Yeah, I mean, I
Shannon.
think there's still a lot of work to do, right? But we do have that North Star, like you say, in a grounding now. Like I think we have a financial policy that says, you must include life cycle costs in your budgets. That wasn't really being well enforced, and that I think largely had to do with the lack of how do departments do that without some kind of guidance? And then if you do it, everybody's doing it differently, right? And so I think it's helped give some structure that we can point to. There's a lot of cultural paradigms that we need to roll back with this, right? So now that we have something that we can point to and ground everybody in, even as turnover happens, I think we'll make greater gains. And one thing that we are seeing is greater engagement with council, for sure. Like that is absolutely something that we've established. And that's a great thing. It's a great thing.
And do you want to talk about the council role items before Nick takes this down?
Perhaps that's aspirational role.
Okay. All right.
They work
All
for
right,
the
then.
voters, not for
All right.
asset
So Nick,
managers.
you can bring the slide
Yeah.
down then.
Well, I'm really glad you actually used the phrase outcomes, because one of the questions we should all be asking when we're talking about any infrastructure division is who is better off and how do you know? And one of I think it's important to daylight this debate is there are conversations that, oh, what is this asset management world? It's you're putting numbers on everything and you're trying to I don't know, make like very process and bean counter oriented decisions around things that perhaps should be led conversationally or more organically and should evolve that way. And I think it's a good conversation to have. And we don't need to say, oh, we need to do an ISO compliant system, or we need to follow, policy FIN 2.19, which is what the title of our policy is. We need to engage everyone appropriately. We need to know what our current practices are. We need to know what service we actually want to provide to who, where, and when, and how. And then compare that to where we are today and make those adjustments. And so stepping back, it's like the goals of equity and anti-racism and inclusion are 100% supported by the tools of asset management. And having that conversation was really helpful to me personally, and I've heard others express that. So those are the outcomes we're after. And I'll just share one other specific. There's a lot of little wins that have happened. I'll just share one. I was able to get a position on my team to focus on this natural asset management and natural asset evaluation. So, we have the policy internally, we submit budget requests, and it's everything from we need an additional plumber, or additional accountant, or swimming instructor. And in that environment, it's a pretty big deal to actually win a position to focus on that. So I really appreciated our leadership support in that, and is a move in a really good direction. I'm really excited for where that specific aspect of asset management is going.
It was really good for you to say that, you don't have to worry about, the specifics of ISO 55001, but will you share how you did use that and how it informed you yourself as a guide?
Do you want to take that, Shannon, or?
Well, so in our department, in our bureau, and my team, I guess, we do reference that as so we do have a strategic asset management plan for our department, and that was largely based on the guidance and structural components of from the ISO 55000 and others. It's not just ISO 50. There's a lot of good resources out there, and so we leverage the asset management policy to help make it more specific, because if you've looked at the ISO 55000, it's not prescriptive, right? It tells you maybe what you need, but it doesn't really tell you how to go about doing it and building it out, the framework out for your organization. It just kind of tells you the components and defines them in some way. But it's really up to the way I interpret it is it's really up to the organization to decide how to go about doing any. I mean, it's a lot of work, right? And especially when you start taking into account how to engage the community to inform your it really can be overwhelming. And so I think having something like the asset management policy to give some sense of direction helps even maybe focus organizations within the organization to focus in on, where do I need to focus my attention and limited resources most? What's going to get me the biggest gains, right? Maybe it's just a spreadsheet that lists all of your assets, right? I mean, some people are really literally starting there, right? What do we own, and how much is it?
Everybody is.
Yeah.
Everybody is. Yeah.
So I think that was, that for our, for my team, we have more maturity in certain portfolios that we manage. We have a large diversity of services that we provide within, the wastewater and stormwater component. We have natural assets. We have a lot of hard assets. And so we can't just have a one size fits all framework. And so we have to take that into account as well, right? And so I think hopefully that was a good answer. But the ISO 55 is a guide. It's not overly prescriptive, and I think you really need to take stock of the maturity of your situation and just break the elephant down into small pieces and use the ISO 55 and other reference materials as a guide.
And if I could add to that, and so Parks and Rec, I'd say as an industry, we're probably less mature than the EPA regulated utilities, and then or even any transportation. There's been policy and efforts around transportation for years, and boy, that language the ISO language would not work for Parks and Rec or many of the departments in the city of Portland. And so, but it was a debate. So back to those, 2020, 2019, some people wanted to say, oh, let's just say, follow ISO and we'll reference the standard and that's it. We did make the conscious decision that nope, we're going to spell out the specific categories to work on for now, because we know the policy is going to change. There's a question in there about personal property. There was an acknowledgement that it's necessary to apply those principles to equipment, personal property, all those sorts of things. And then just in terms of workload, it was like, we just need to focus on the long-term hard infrastructure capital investments for now. And someone can start another group that meets 12 hours a year to focus on the personal property because we're just at capacity. So that was really where we were at.
And Nick, will you bring on Jack Kelly as a panelist? Jack Kelly is a board member of the ALN. He's an ALN senior fellow. He was with the White House Office of Management and Budget for 36 years. He established the GSA government-wide policy office, but he's got a question for you because he's involved in the city of Rockville in Maryland, where he lives. Hi, Jack. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. And I got to say, this is a inspirational presentation that y'all have provided us, and I'm gonna be sharing it with some of my colleagues in the city to see if I can see if it resonates with some of them. But the question I was going to ask, but I'm not sure you haven't already answered it, was how you got started and what, you know, and how things rolled out. Let me tell you what stood out to me, because one of the issues that I struggle with in trying to get people in the city government, both at the mayor and council level and also at the staff level, to get their attention on asset management. It's not all that different from the problems I've had in trying to get my former colleagues at OMB to understand the value of asset management and to do something about it. And so what I heard from y'all is you had several sort of precipitating events that got people to think about this. And I love the fact that y'all started with resilience, and it was all about, and I don't know if this came about organically or somebody said, hey, we need to realize that resilience is affected or affects the interdependence, affects and is affected by the interdependence of all the asset owning entities. Because, you know, your examples were perfect. Like if the water system goes down, that affects not just people's drinking water, it affects the ability of the fire department to put out fires. It affects, you know, the ability of other things to operate. And the same thing is true of other interdependency. So that was a big one. The second one is it didn't start. A lot of things, you know, a lot of governments think that things have to start at the political level, at the highest level, and that the worker bees aren't going to do anything unless they're told to do it. Well, that's not the way that's not the way, in fact, it normally does happen. The way it happens normally is the way it happened for you guys. Within the federal government, for example, where asset management has gotten traction, it's in small organizations that have problems and that have been looking for solutions and have sort of tumbled upon asset management as a high potential set of solutions that can help them solve their problems. And so it starts organically within people getting aware of it, and then, you know, getting either within their scope of responsibilities, they have the ability to do something. For example, in the Corps of Engineers, the asset management office there, what it could do was create a maintenance management manual that was sent out throughout the Corps. They didn't have to challenge the district structure or anything like that. They owned this manual. And what they did with the maintenance management manual was they said, we're not going to have the same old policies toward repairing everything when it falls apart, when it breaks. Before we fix it, we're going to make sure it's mission critical, and we're going to devote our attention and our finances to mission critical assets, not just any old asset that fails. And so that was, you know, that seemed like a small thing, but it's really a huge thing. And
Oh,
it was
Jack,
one of the,
thank you for those comments. And let me ask the question that Jack Kelly asked me before this started, was how did asset management get started in Portland in 2002, I believe, is around the time. Is there any history that either of you know about what got Portland started? Because Jack's trying to get it started in Rockville, and he's wondering what, you know, policy is like way advanced. He just wants to have some kind of asset management thinking.
Well, so I'll just speak for what I know from my department and how it got started in my department. And I think you're absolutely right, Jack. For us, it was really triggered by the CSO policy. Our asset management was initiated because we were in danger of having a consent decree because of our CSO system, right? So in the early 90s, we were facing a regulatory mandate that we had to figure out what to do with our, to manage and rein in our combined sewer overflows. So what we did, what the Bureau of Environmental Services decided to do was employ an asset management strategy to identify what the critical elements were and how to manage them. So that's in I think 95-ish, we started our condition assessment program. We started collecting data on our and building an asset inventory for our pipes, our pipe networks. And from there, it just started building. And so a CSO policy, our response to that is now almost 30 years old. So we've been practicing at some level asset management efforts that have, and frankly, our asset management framework for our combined and sanitary sewer assets are the most mature portfolios that we have in terms of our asset management framework. So it's that's one thing I like to point out, is that asset management is an ongoing living system. It's not something that you just decide to do one day and all of a sudden you flip a switch and you're done. It's you build into maturity. And so at least that's how it was for our department. I don't have the history that Chris does, so I'll let him speak to maybe what he knows about the broader city asset management, but it was really very internal, I would say. That's not something that we negotiated with other departments on. That was a very internal, regulatorily driven decision. And I'll point out that sometimes those regulatory drivers can be very good opportunities to institute something like asset management, right? So I think, however you want to look at them, I think it was a really good thing for the city of Portland for us to actually be pushed a little bit to hyper focus on that. So Chris, I'll let you step in here.
Yeah, I think that's the story of Portland, is the EPA regulated utilities were the start. For Parks and Recreation, bluntly, it was an audit. My position didn't exist until there was an audit of capital planning, and the city auditor is an independently elected position, and they choose what they want to audit. And they got the idea that perhaps parts of the organization could do better with capital planning. They did the audit, published it, and then the response, an action plan was created, including the creation of the position that I now hold. So those external factors, as we mentioned, the surprise about the first responder equipment. There's always policy windows. It's, what's a good one to grab and be ready for it. And, is it unfortunately a catastrophic failure, is often opens a policy window, regulatory drivers, or a really effective internal champion.
Jack, before you get started, I'm going to say thank you to everyone. We're not going to do our typical overtime break and have Nick coming in and keep going. We're just going to keep rolling here as long as Shannon and Chris can stay. I don't want to overtax you. I know how busy you are. But with that, I'll say, okay, Jack, go ahead.
I wasn't going to overtax anybody. But here's one of the things that surprises me. Hearing about, so from a federal perspective, the two federal programs that from my perspective look like they have embraced or required asset management more than any others. EPA is one of them, but it's the weaker of the two. The strongest one is the transportation program, because if you deal with local transit agencies, or for that matter, at the state level, state highway departments, they are required by a piece of legislation called MAP 21 to, as a condition of receiving federal transportation grants, they have to demonstrate some awareness of asset management. Now, it's a little bit different in the sense that highway departments have to essentially talk about how they create their SAMPs. They call it just, how did you create your asset management plan? But that's basically a SAMP. And then the transit agencies have to actually demonstrate that they have asset management plans, which, it's one of those things. It's a good thing, but it's not everything you should probably be doing. So,
yeah,
but I'm sorry. Go ahead, Chris.
Oh no, those drivers are probably necessary, and sorry for geeking out and saying not sufficient, because
right.
What we saw, for us to get the policy and start this roadmap forward, is there was a critical mass of subject experts, and I actually, when we talked about having the debate of what we're going to focus on, I've long time felt that training is absolutely the most important thing, and training and awareness. And until you get some sort of just general, I get it, or the basic concepts, get it. We had a CFO who gets it. And until there's that, no policy is going to go anywhere, and no practice is going to go anywhere. I do wonder how often those map compliant plans and stuff, how many of them are produced to get a grant and don't reflect the actual practice of asset management within the organization. And as opposed to, we're practicing asset management, oh, hey, let's cap it off with a policy to codify what we're already doing and what we want to do. There's got to be enough people that know what we're talking about. And I think that's just a general change model, whether we're talking about advancing equity or whether we're talking about other types of change in organizational goals. There has to be enough people in an organization who know what we're talking about.
Well, that's what we're trying to do with the Asset Leadership Network. So thank you for getting this out there, letting us post this. We'll create highlights. But what were you going to say, Shannon?
Well, I was just going to add to Chris's thought there, and that and especially the part about how many of those grants are requested or put forward without that asset management strategy. And one thing that me and my team I like to throw out a lot is, just because it's on sale doesn't mean that we should buy it. And honestly, asset management is about taking us away out of that kind of impulsive advocacy environment and more into a strategic positioning environment, leaving risk on the table that we're comfortable with, and moving forward with acquiring resources to actually meet our strategic goals. And I think that is a really powerful position to be in. I agree with Chris. I think that the opportunities that are presented from like regulatory triggers are initiators. They're not the things that get us through to kind of that strategic position, and they can actually at times be burdens, I'll say, because they're not based in asset management. They're based on regulatory drivers. The other thing I'd like to mention too is that there's another concept of catch up, keep up, get ahead. You can't get ahead if you're playing catch up, or if you need to play catch up. And oftentimes I see a lot of kind of advocacy grant requisitions, I guess, that really are about getting ahead, the new shiny thing, or the new technology, or the new, I don't know, anything new, but we haven't adequately dealt with the maintenance of our core services, right? The assets that support core services. And I think a lot of municipalities are experiencing this, where we have a backlog of work, and yet here we are putting forward projects that rely on that network of basic services, but they're not super functional, right? Or they're at risk of failing. And so what does that do for your new shiny thing when you try to kick it on and the underlying infrastructure isn't there to support it? So I think those two things kind of resonate with me in this work, and trying to get council in particular to get away from being moved by the advocacy and the new shiny thing, and focusing more on the less fun maybe aspects of just catching up and then keeping up, and then not buying things because they're on sale.
Well, we want to let you be able to go before, it's like last minute. So just great thanks for all the work that you did to set up the policy and marshal it through its next phases. And thank you for sharing the work that you've done with the Asset Leadership Network. And we look forward to future participation. Maybe we can get you in a panel with Richard Dietz and other municipalities, and maybe we can do something for Jack Kelly, maybe a web executive briefing for his Rockville mayor or something. But we'll talk about that offline. But just great thanks. And Nick, and Jack Kelly, thanks for jumping in and participating, joining in the fun. Nick, if you want to wind things up, but Chris and Shannon, if you have any closing statements you'd like to make.
Thank you for the opportunity, Mike, and I've appreciated the network over the years, and I'm constantly learning as well. And so a lot of that has been through the network and everyone who's participating here. So, and again, feel free to reach out to me, anyone online, offline, if there's like specific documents or things that might help your journey.
Okay.
Shannon, do you want to close with anything, or shall I take us away?
No, just thank you and thanks for the opportunity. It was great.
Awesome. Well, so grateful to have had both of you here today. Really awesome presentation and discussion that obviously the audience was quite engaged with. So thank you to our patron members as well for helping make this sort of programming possible, and to all our other organizational members. Your continued support is what makes this possible. So thank you. And thank you especially to Definitive Logic for sponsoring this week's ALN Thursday at 3. With that, we'll say, see you all next Thursday and in the future. Thanks again.